Fog rolled through the empty fields long before the first bell rang. No one had stepped inside St. Michael's for decades, yet the prayers never stopped, and each night, the sound grew closer. When Bill Turner moved into the old house beside the church, he thought it was just the wind or rusted metal swaying in the steeple. But by the time he pressed play on his last recording, the voices were already calling his name. Greetings, every shadow hides a story. Welcome. Under the bed. It happened in Ashford, a two-lane town off Highway 17 in northern Iowa, the last place you'd pull over unless the fuel light begged you. September 2024. Nights were already colder, the fields cut low, and the wind came across flat land like a blade. I was there because I needed quiet. My name is Bill Turner, 48. A year earlier I'd had a small heart attack, and 3 months after that my wife, and didn't wake up. I sold what we had in Cedar Rapids and bought a weathered single-story on Mill Road, the one with the leaning fence and a view of St. Michael's, an old brick church everyone said was closed for decades. You could see the steeple from my kitchen window, a thin black triangle against the sky. The realtor had shrugged when I asked why it was shuttered. No congregation since the 90s, she said. Priest left. Happens. The county records said its last service was in 1998. A note in the clerk's file mentioned dwindling attendance and structural concerns. The doors were chained and the windows clouded with dust where storm grit had sandblasted the glass. My first week was a list of small tasks: patching drywall, bleeding the baseboards, learning which outlet didn't spark. I stacked ins boxes in a spare room and told myself I'd open them later. At night I boiled chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table with the window cracked, hearing nothing but tractors miles off and the slow ticking of the house settling. On the 7th night, I woke at 3:07 a.m. to a sound I shouldn't have heard. A bell. One clear strike, then another, spaced like a metronome. Not a recording. Metal on metal. It came thin across the fields, from the direction of St. Michael's. I lay still, counting. 12 rings, then a hush that felt too thick for a small town. I listened for coyotes. I heard my own breath. I told myself about wind and loose hardware and the way old roofs move. I slept with the light on until dawn. In the morning I walked over. The grass between my fence and the church lot was knee-high and seeded, the kind of dead gold that snaps when you step. The chain on the double doors was real, not a prop. The padlock was orange with rust. I looked up at the belfry and saw nothing but bird nests wedged in the louvers. No fresh footprints, no tire tracks. I pressed my ear to the wood, felt the cold come through, and told myself I was being ridiculous. That afternoon at Miller's Gas and Groceries I asked the cashier, a woman with a name tag that said Joyce, if anyone used the church bell for anything. No one goes there, she said without looking up from the lotto machine. Kids did for a while. Sheriff put a stop to it. Why? I told her I thought I'd heard it ring. She smiled the way people do when you say something that doesn't fit. Wind does tricks, she said. Out here it sounds like trains and bells and voices. Don't listen to it. The next night, I tried not to. I put in foam earplugs, watched the red digits roll over, and let the TV talk to the empty room. I almost made it. At 3:07 the plug in my right ear worked loose. The bell came through, faint but perfect, 12 times again, the last one longer, like a hand reluctant to let the rope go. I sat up too fast and felt my pulse thud at the scar in my chest. I counted again. 12. The same. By dawn I had a plan that felt simple enough to prove a point. I found an old handheld digital recorder in a box labeled Garage, back when I used it for job site notes, and charged it at the sink while coffee burned on the warmer. After lunch I walked to the church and set the device on the concrete step, angled under the door where the chain crossed. I wrapped a trash bag around it in case of dew and taped the bag tight. I marked the time in a notebook, 2:13 p.m. I told myself I'd pick it up after sunrise. Evening fell early. The sky turned the color of cold iron and the corn stubble out back shone pale like old bone. I went to bed fully dressed. I did not use earplugs. I lay with my eyes on the ceiling and the window cracked, the curtain lifting and falling with each quiet breath of wind. The house ticked. The refrigerator coughed. A car went by on 17 and faded to a hiss. At 3:07 the bell rang. There is a difference between hearing and knowing you hear. The first strike made my molars ache. The second settled like a weight behind my sternum. By the third I was out of bed, by the fourth at the back door, by the fifth in the yard holding my flashlight with a shaking wrist. Across the lot, the steeple was a serrated black against a darker sky. The bell kept time, 6, 7, 8, 12 and all, then nothing but the wind moving through the dry weeds. I did not walk across then. I stood with the flashlight off and let my eyes adjust. The church windows were dead glass. The doors were as I had left them. I went back inside and sat at the table until a pale stripe of morning unrolled along the horizon. At 6:11 a.m. I crossed the yard and peeled the tape from the recorder with numb fingers. Back home, I set it on the table, pressed play, and listened to my own footsteps fade, the hum of insects, the far cough of a truck on the highway. At 3:07 on the timestamp the bell began, exactly 12 strikes. Then, between the 9th and 10th, something else came faintly through the tiny speaker, a low thread of sound that made my skin prickle. Not wind. Not an animal. A voice, many voices, layered thin by distance, like a choir in a room with heavy walls. After the 12th strike there was a light scrape, as if a bench had shifted on stone. Then a pause, breath-like. And then, almost lost in the noise floor, a single word in a steady male voice, syllables blurred by the recorder but steady enough to understand. Amen. I stopped the playback and realized I had put my hand on my chest without meaning to. I rewound and played the last seconds again. The same scrape. The same pause. The same word. Amen. The church had been closed since 1998. It had no electricity, no priest, no reason to hold a service. But on my cheap recorder, left alone under a chained door on a clear night, there was a bell, a choir, and a word that closes prayer. I wrote the time down in the notebook, the way a man writes down blood pressure, as if numbers can keep things safe. 3:07 a.m. 12 strikes. Choir. Male voice. Amen. Then I added a line I didn't say aloud, if it happens again, go inside. The morning after the recording, I played it 3 more times. Each playback sounded colder, flatter, like the air itself thinned when that amen came through. I emailed the clip to my old friend Rick, who used to work sound at a local radio station. He called after lunch. "Bill," he said, "there's no loop or digital artifact. That's a live sound. You sure someone didn't break in?" "Church is locked," I told him. "Padlocks rusted solid." "Then you caught something real," he said quietly. "But not something I'd want on my porch." That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the church through the kitchen window, the recorder lying on the table beside my coffee mug. The field between us shimmered with fog. Around 2, a shape flickered by the steeple, a flash of pale, like a reflection, then gone. I told myself I was tired. But by 3:07, before the bell even rang, I was already standing by the door. I waited. The first strike hit exactly on time. 12 again. But this time, between the bells, I heard something else. Not words, breathing. Slow, uneven, too close to be wind. In the morning I drove to town. The sheriff's office was 2 rooms behind the library. Sheriff Daly had been there since the late 80s. I handed him my phone with the recording. He listened, expressionless, thumb tapping the table in rhythm with the bells. When it ended, he slid the phone back. "We've had calls before," he said. "Kids camping out there, old folks hearing things. It's just sound bouncing off the silos." "Silos don't say amen," I said. He stared for a second, then stood. "Don't go in there at night, Bill. Sound does funny things to people when they're alone." Driving home, I noticed something strange. The power lines near the church leaned as if wind pushed them, but there was no wind. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. Even the crows that usually perched on the fence were gone. That evening, I set up the recorder again, this time inside my window facing the church. I left it running while I sat on the porch. The sunset faded to a rust color and the first frost of the year glazed the grass. At 3:07, the bell came again. Only this time, it didn't stop at 12. It kept ringing, 13, 14, 15, then silence so complete my ears rang. When I checked the recorder in the morning, I realized the extra rings never appeared in the audio. Only 12. The rest had happened in my head, or worse, inside the house. 2 days later, I bought a used security camera from a pawn shop in town, one with night vision and a motion sensor. I mounted it on a post facing the church door. Around dusk, the air smelled of rain, though the forecast was clear. The sky went green-gray, the kind that means lightning without thunder. I stayed awake, watching the monitor on my desk. Midnight passed. At 3:07, motion triggered the feed. For 2 seconds the image warped, static tearing across the frame. Then a faint glow appeared inside the church window. It pulsed, soft and rhythmic, like candlelight through smoke. I stared at that glow until dawn. When the sun came up, I went over to check. The ground was wet though there'd been no rain. The church door was still locked, the chain unmoved. But something new waited there, a folded paper tucked into the iron handle. It was brittle and smelled of wax. The writing was faded, like it had been touched by many hands. I opened it carefully. One sentence. "Those who listen will be heard." My stomach twisted. The handwriting was mine. Same loops, same half-crossed T's. I felt dizzy, stepped back, and dropped the paper into the weeds. When I looked up at the steeple, something flickered, a shimmer behind the louvers, like movement. A shape leaned briefly toward the light, as if someone was watching from inside. That night, the bell didn't ring. Instead, a single low note, more vibration than sound, rolled across the fields around 2:30. The house lights dimmed and came back. I walked outside, the frost cracking under my boots, and aimed the flashlight at the church. The beam caught something pale in the window, a face, or maybe only frost forming a pattern. But then the faintest movement followed, a tilt of the head, deliberate and human. I backed away until my heel hit the porch step. The beam trembled in my hand. And through the cold, thick air, a whisper drifted across the distance, not words, only a long-drawn breath that ended like a sigh. The sound of someone preparing to speak again. I shut the door, locked it twice, and sat by the recorder until dawn. When I played the audio, there was no bell, no sigh, no voice. Only one faint sound near the end, low and steady, a heartbeat. Not mine. By the end of that week, I hadn't slept more than an hour at a time. Every night I sat by the kitchen window, waiting for the bells, for the glow, for anything that might make sense of what I'd seen. But nothing came. Just silence, the kind that hums inside your head when the world is holding its breath. I told myself it was over, that whatever I'd recorded, whatever had written that note, was finished. But deep down, I knew the quiet wasn't peace. It was a pause. Saturday morning, the frost finally melted. I went out to the church with a crowbar, telling myself I was going to end it, check the inside, prove it empty, and move on. The padlock broke easier than it should have, metal snapping under one pull. The doors creaked open with the sound of wood peeling from its own frame. Cold air poured out, dry, like the air inside a freezer that's been shut too long. Inside, the church smelled of old stone, candle wax, and something faintly metallic, like blood long dried. The windows were caked with grime, the pews tilted where the floor had buckled. But the strangest part was the dust. It covered everything evenly, except for one long aisle of clean footprints leading straight to the altar. Bare feet. Adult-sized. No shoes, no smudge, just deep, perfect impressions that hadn't filled back in. I followed them, step by step, until I reached the front. The altar cloth was still there, yellowed with age, embroidered with gold thread that had turned green. On it lay a single candle stub, long burned out, and beside it, a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, but the pages inside were dry, untouched by time. The first page was blank. The second, too. On the third, words appeared faintly in pencil. The names of those who hurt us. Below that, rows of names, hundreds of them, written in different hands and fading styles, as if added over many years. Some were dated from the 1940s, others from 1971, 1986, 1998. I kept turning the pages until I reached the last entry. My chest went tight. It said, Bill Turner, 2025. I froze. My handwriting. Same uneven slant, same half-formed letters. I stared until the lines blurred, until the thought crept in that maybe I had written it and just didn't remember. But why would I? And when? A gust of air moved through the church then, though the doors behind me were still. Dust swirled in patterns, slow and deliberate, curling around the altar like breath. I took a step back, the floorboards groaning under my boots. A whisper followed, not words, just the rhythm of something repeating. Then a faint echo, like the tail end of a chant, voices overlapping, layered, hundreds of them. I dropped the notebook, the sound too loud in that dead space. When it hit the floor, the candle rolled and stopped at my boot. I turned and ran, stumbling into the daylight like a man escaping a cave. The air outside hit warm, alive. But when I looked down, the frost on the ground was disturbed again, new footprints leading from the church door to the edge of my fence. My fence. That evening, I tried to convince myself I'd imagine the handwriting, the voices, the footprints. I told myself it was exhaustion. But the book wouldn't leave my mind. I went back just before sunset, thinking I'd grab it and show the sheriff, something tangible to prove I wasn't losing it. The doors opened without resistance this time. The notebook was still there, but now it lay open on a different page. At the top, written in fresh graphite, was a new line. He returned. He will stay. I felt a cold pressure in the air, a vibration deep in my ears. The silence around me folded inward, and for a moment it felt like the whole church was breathing. The pews creaked, one after another, as if people were sitting down. The dust lifted from the seats in thin shapes, like the suggestion of shoulders and bowed heads. I stumbled backward, but something made me stop at the door. I turned one last time and saw movement near the altar, faint, almost transparent. A figure in a dark robe stood where the candle had been, head bowed. Slowly, it looked up. There was no face. Just a hollow where the features should be, filled with shadow. The right hand lifted, not in threat, but in blessing, and the air filled with that single word again, quiet but firm. Amen. The sound chased me all the way home. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat shaking at the table until morning. When I finally looked outside, the fog was thick and unmoving. Through it, barely visible, the church steeple stood, and for the first time since I'd arrived in Ashford, smoke was rising from it, curling slowly into the gray sky. The end, Episode 3. By the following morning, I was certain something inside the church wanted to be heard. That notebook hadn't written itself, and my name didn't appear there by chance. I'd spent the night replaying the events over and over, trying to apply reason, sleep deprivation, stress, hallucination. But reason crumbled every time I remembered the voice saying amen. There was no denying what I'd seen. The footprints, the movement, the sound of pews shifting under invisible weight. I decided I needed proof that couldn't be argued away. Not audio. Not memory. Real footage. Around noon I drove 40 miles to Cedar Falls and bought a new camera, a small high-definition model with night vision and a motion sensor. I didn't tell the clerk what it was for. I just said I was filming owls. That evening I waited until dusk. The fog had thickened, and the church stood half-hidden behind it like something painted over too many times. I mounted the camera on a wooden stake facing the front doors and checked the lens angle twice. Before leaving, I whispered out loud, though I wasn't sure to whom. If you want someone to hear you, this will do it. Then I went home, left the house dark, and set up the monitor beside my chair. At 3:07 the bell rang, distant and clear. The camera's motion light blinked on the screen. For a few seconds everything stayed normal, the frame steady, the grain soft from fog. Then the picture began to tremble, a faint shimmer running along the edges of the doorway like heat haze. The image distorted, pixel lines crawling across the feed. Through the static, I thought I saw movement, something tall and human-shaped stepping through the fog, stopping right before the lens. Then the frame went black. I rewound the clip and froze it right before the distortion. There it was again, faint but visible, a silhouette in the doorway, arms at its sides, head slightly bowed. It looked exactly like a priest about to speak. My throat tightened. I left the monitor running and tried to steady my breathing, but every creak of the house sounded like a footstep behind me. When daylight came, I walked back to the church. The fog hadn't lifted, only thinned to a gray veil that blurred the fields. The camera still stood on its stake, untouched. But the ground around it was different, muddy, trampled. Dozens of footprints, all barefoot, led from the church steps to where I stood. I pulled the camera free and almost dropped it. The lens was smeared with something black and sticky, like soot. Back home, I cleaned the lens and checked the memory card. The video file was there, but longer than I remembered, over 3 hours. The first half showed only static and fog. Then, near the end, a shape emerged. The same figure I'd seen before now stood close enough to fill the frame. The robe was heavy and dark, the folds moving as though stirred by unseen air. Slowly, one hand reached toward the camera, pale and slender. The moment its fingers touched the lens, the feed froze and a sharp, metallic ringing filled the speakers, like a bell struck underwater. I shut the laptop, heart hammering, and realized the ringing hadn't stopped. It wasn't the recording anymore. It was coming from outside. I ran to the window. The steeple loomed through the fog, and the bell was swinging, slow but heavy. Each strike sounded wrong, hollow, as though the air itself resisted it. Between the tolls, a low murmur drifted over the field, a congregation repeating words I couldn't make out. My skin prickled. I called the sheriff again, voice shaking. "You need to come out here. It's happening right now." He sighed. "Bill, I told you." "No," I said. "You'll hear it yourself. The bell, the voices, just get here." By the time his truck rolled up 20 minutes later, the sound had stopped. The church stood silent, fog curling around its steps like smoke. Daly looked tired, unimpressed. He walked to the door, tugged the chain, found it still tight. "You see? Empty. You been drinking, Bill?" I didn't answer. My eyes had caught something behind him, a faint red glow leaking from under the door. He turned to look, but the moment he did, it was gone. "Stay out of there," he said, getting back into his truck. "Next time, I'm taking that camera. You're scaring folks." When he left, I went inside my house and sat at the table, staring at the still image frozen on the monitor, the hand reaching toward the lens. I enlarged the frame, zooming in until the pixels broke apart. The hand wasn't just pale. There were letters faintly carved into the skin, each one forming a single word. "Listen." The power flickered, once, twice, then steadied. I didn't sleep that night. Around 5 a.m., when the sky began to lighten, I heard the faint click of metal outside my door. I opened it slowly. The camera was sitting on my porch, exactly where I'd left it by the church, lens cracked but still aimed upward. Later that day, the sheriff called to say the county would be sealing the property, warning me not to return. But when I looked out the window that evening, I saw the fog rising again and, through it, a dim flicker of candlelight inside the church. The next night, I placed the camera inside. I hadn't planned to go back inside. I told myself the camera would capture whatever needed capturing, that I could watch from a distance and keep the truth at arm's length. But as the fourth night fell, something shifted. The air carried that same faint vibration again, a low hum like a distant choir warming up its first note. It crawled through the walls, through the floor, through my chest. By 2:30 a.m., I couldn't sit still. When the clock hit 3:07, the first bell rang. Not from far away this time, from inside my head. I felt it reverberate in my ribs, slow and heavy. I looked toward the church and saw the glow again, faint but steady, pouring from the doorway like breath from a mouth that shouldn't move. I took the flashlight, the recorder, and walked out the back door without a coat. The fog swallowed everything. My steps made no sound. When I reached the fence line, the air smelled like burned wax and cold stone. The church doors stood open, the chain unhooked and lying in the dirt like a shed skin. I should have turned back. Instead, I crossed the threshold. Inside, it was bright, not from electricity, but from hundreds of candles burning in long rows down both aisles. Their flames didn't flicker. They stood straight, perfect, like they were painted there. Every pew was full. Shapes sat in them, not solid, not air, but outlines, the space where people should have been. They were kneeling, their heads bowed, hands clasped. I could hear them whispering, every voice layered on another, forming a low, endless chant. I tried to speak, but my throat locked. The camera's red light blinked once on my jacket, recording. I raised it slowly and aimed toward the altar. The figure stood there again, the priest in the dark robe, motionless. He turned his head toward me, and this time the face wasn't shadow. It was a blur of shifting skin, like smoke trapped under glass. The voice that followed came from everywhere at once. "You heard us," it said. "Now we hear you." The chanting stopped. The silence that followed pressed down so hard I thought my ears would burst. I took a step backward, and the candles flared white, as if they exhaled all at once. My flashlight blinked out. In the afterimage, I saw only the altar, and on it, the same notebook, open to a new page. My name again. Below it, a date. October 16th, 2025. My breath caught. That was today. I turned to run, but the aisle stretched longer than before, the door shrinking into the distance. The chanting began again, but now it came from behind me, hundreds of voices repeating the same two words, stay. Pray. The air grew thick. I could taste metal. My legs went numb halfway to the door, my heartbeat pounding like a drum inside a well. The last thing I remember seeing was the priest lifting his hand, and the bell above answering him with a single, thunderous strike. The camera slipped from my grip. Everything went dark. When I woke, it was daylight. The candles were gone, the pews empty. The air smelled of coal dust and rain. I was lying near the altar, the notebook open beside me. The page with my name was gone, torn cleanly out. My camera sat beside it, still recording. I checked the screen, 3 hours of footage, the last few minutes blurred by static. I pressed play anyway. At first, the video showed only me entering, walking toward the altar. Then it jumped, frames missing, sound distorted. The next clear image made my blood run cold. It showed the priest standing where I had been, looking down at the camera. His face was mine. My voice came through the speakers, calm and distant. The service begins now. I dropped the camera, heart pounding. The words echoed, louder, overlapping themselves until they sounded like a crowd repeating them. The recording cut off with a loud crack. That evening, Sheriff Daly came to check on me after I didn't answer his calls. He found the front door open, lights still on. The kitchen chair was knocked over. On the table sat the recorder, still running. He later told the paper he heard faint voices in the background, hundreds of them whispering in unison. The last clear sound was a bell ringing 12 times, then a single, steady breath. They searched the area for days. My truck was in the driveway, my jacket folded neatly on the porch. The only thing missing was me. The church, however, had changed. The lock was gone, the doors ajar. Inside, the altar was spotless. On it lay a new notebook, brand new leather, open to its first page. In black ink, written neatly in the center, was a single line. Bill Turner, Keeper of the Prayer. That night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the bell rang again. People in town said it sounded different, slower, deeper, almost human. Some swore they heard words hidden inside the tolling, a voice repeating the same phrase over and over. The service continues. Since then, no one's dared to go near St. Michael's. But every night, when the fog rolls in from the fields, the faint glow of candles can still be seen through the windows. And if you listen closely, under the bell, you can hear the sound of one more voice, steady, clear, leading the prayer.